Basically, for myself, my involvement with shamanism has been a deepening meditation over now about 20 years. And it seems to me very fruitful because it continues to change and integrate itself ever more deeply into the meaning of reality at large. So that for me, shamanism has become a kind of overarching metaphor for not only personal being in the world, but the historical adventure, the being of the species in the world. So I want to talk about it today, and as an advocate, I want to make it seem indispensable to living a life of right reason in the world. I want to show that without shamanism, the notion of humanism itself is in a kind of jeopardy. And probably most of us can find ourselves in agreement with that. But then I want to leave most of us behind and go further and suggest that this humanness rooted in shamanism is a humanness ultimately rooted in very complex symbiotic relationships with plants and chemicals in the environment. Want to argue, in fact, that people without plants are in a state of potential neurosis, a state of existential wanting, and that, in fact, part of the Western dilemma is the sense of abandonment that followed with the breaking off of these symbiotic relations with vision-producing plants that characterized the rise of Western monotheism and even more characterized the rise of modern society. But let me return then to the origins, because this is where I think the case can be made. My interpretation of the time we're living through and this amorphous movement that we all somehow in some way are a part of, which calls itself the New Age or what have you. I call it the Archaic Revival. And the reason I call it the Archaic Revival is rooted in my conviction that it is, in fact, a revivifying of the models and energy forms of archaism. And shamanism, then, is suddenly centrally highlighted. Shamanism was the profession ne plus ultra of the Upper Neolithic era. And what was this profession precisely about? Well, it was about exploring the envelope of cognition, pushing against the linguistic membrane of what it was possible to say, symbolize, conceive, and communicate. Now, why should one species, out of all those competing on the earth, attain somehow a kind of mega-adaptive ability that causes a kind of compression of biological time into the phenomenon that we call history? Is it simply, as our theologians have always been forced to conceive, that divine agency entered into the mechanism of the world and somehow set a spark in motion that kindled and grew into humanity? Or is it, as the 19th century explored so exhaustively, the possibility that incremental change can eventually initiate and insinuate into a situation new states of higher order, including even possibly the state of higher order that we call self-reflecting consciousness. That somehow this is no more than a gradual refinement out of previous states of nature. Well, what I want to suggest is that it is a bit of both of these points of view, the divine intervention and the evolutionary. I think what evolutionary biologists have missed in looking at the emergence of human beings out of the primate phylogeny is, generally speaking, the mutagenic influence of foods. The fact that a fruit-eating arboreal primate, because of a situation of spreading dryness in the environment, evolved into a pack-hunting creature of the grasslands with an omnivorous diet. And omnivores, by their very nature, expose themselves to a very large number of mutagenic influences. I'm speaking now chemically. Mutagenic influences that interfere with correct copying of protein, interfere with spacing of children, lactation, interfere with mentation, psychoactive compounds in the food chain. And it's very interesting that as human beings transform themselves into omnivorous, pack-hunting omnivores, you begin to see the first faint stirrings of self-reflection. You begin to get the fire pits and later the chipped flint leavings of earliest Neolithic human tool making. What this says to me is that there was a unique confluence of factors present in the evolutionary situation that were capable of kindling this ontological transformation of what had previously been the animal mind. And what I suggest this factor is, or was, psychoactive plants in the environment, specifically psychoactive plants in the grasslands environment in which human pastoralism evolved in Africa over 1 million years ago. The plant must be African. It must be extraordinarily noticeable in the environment. It must not be a deep forest endemic, because this is not where human evolution was taking place. The only plant which fits this description is a mushroom of the psilocybin-containing variety. And it's very easy to see, I think, that the presence then of psychoactive compounds of this sort in the early human diet set the stage for a number of structural and psychological changes. Psilocybin ingested in low doses increases visual acuity. Now, it's not difficult to see that in an animal under evolutionary pressure in a pack-hunting environment, increased visual acuity will mean a more successful reproductive strategy. This means that those animals not including the psychoactive substance in their diet will be mitigated against and fade from the scene. And by this process, a steady bootstrapping process, self-reflection was born in our species. How do we get from visual acuity to self-reflection? Low doses of psilocybin give increased visual acuity. Medium-range doses of psilocybin give an increased interest in erotic activity. You should laugh. There may not be too many laughs with this one. Slightly higher doses of psilocybin give an experience of the numinosum, an actual contact with a mystery in the human psyche, which is no less mysterious to us today than it was to our ancestors when the last glaciation was retreating against Canada. I mean, don't kid yourself. In the face of this, the content of this symbiotic relationship, modernism, rationalism, positivism, all is exposed as just whistling past the graveyard, because the numinous depth of the mystery that seems to have called us out of the animal mind is completely impenetrable to modern analysis. That's why even discussing its presence is mitigated against so intensely. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this early facet of the emergence thing. I want to move ahead and show that as pastoralism developed, as the domestic relationship between cattle, human beings, and mushrooms settled down into a self-reinforcing cycle of consciousness, language arose, religion arose of the goddess-oriented variety, and the connection of the cow to the goddess is there at the dawn time. There is no question about it. Language seems to have been the particular prerogative of women in the early emergent phases. This is possibly because men were involved in hunting activities where great premium is placed on silent stealthiness, while women were engaged as gatherers in the hunting-gathering phase. Women were engaged in gathering plants. And as all botanists can tell you, gathering plants involves an extensive taxonomic language, so that the difference, the minute differences between cereal grains and insects and all of these things need to be linguistically defined and characterized. And to this day, a taxonomic description of a plant is a Joycean thrill to read, because, you know, subapically glabrous with lanceolate trifolium, and so on for many, many lines. But in a strange way that is a law repeated over and over again through history, each advance somehow outsmarts itself. And the wonderful linguistic depth which women attained as gatherers through the production of folk taxonomy eventually led them to a terrible discovery, the discovery of agriculture, because they learned that rather than maintain this vast library of shifting information about seasonal plants randomly distributed or distributed according to the whims of nature, they could in fact focus on a very small number of plants, learn how to grow these plants, learn their needs alone, and at that point the retreat was on and the dualism was fully in place, and there was that which was domesticated, that which was of the hearth, and that which was of the Ausland, the howling unknown, that which was beyond the pale. I think it was Weston LeBar, great old anthropologist, who felt, he said, hallucinogens can only be used in hunting and gathering cultures because when agriculturalists use them, it makes it impossible to get up at dawn and go hoe the fields. And so suddenly the gods become the corn gods and the wheat gods, gods of symbolizing domesticity and hard labor and that sort of thing. And at this moment of agriculture, which led to overproduction, which led to trade, which led to cities, and so forth, there is a beginning of the breaking away of this symbiotic relationship which had bound human beings to nature to this time. And I don't mean this metaphorically. I mean, I want to be taken seriously as proposing that the ennui of modernity is the consequences of a disrupted symbiotic relationship between ourselves and vegetable nature, and that only a restoration of this in some form is going to carry us into a full inheritance of our birthright as human beings. Now, what did this symbiotic relationship consist of? What was the effect of this psychedelic use, this embeddedness of language-using, cognition-using, but stoned primates in the natural order? Well, I submit to you that what it was, or how it acted operationally, was as a feminizing pheromone. That the continuous exposure to this tremendum, represented by the hallucinogenically induced ecstasy, acted to continuously dissolve that portion of the psyche which, as moderns, we call the male ego. And I don't mean that it only worked on men. I mean that wherever in human personalities this certain catch began to form and build like a calcareous tumor in the personality, the psycholytic presence of the undeniable fact of the tremendum tended to dissolve this back into Tao, psychic health, however you wish to style it. And that the evolution of language then, setting up this movement off into specialization and a movement away from nature, set up the consequences of the ennui which permeates Western civilization. It is only in Western civilization that you get this steady focus on this monotheistic ideal and working out the implications of what is essentially a pathological personality pattern, the pattern of the omniscient, omnipresent, all-knowing, wrathful male deity. No one you would invite to your garden party. It's very interesting that this ideal is the only instance, the only hypostatization of deity that I know of that has no congress with woman. At any point in the theological myth, the God of Western civilization has nothing to do with women. And the presence of the Sophia and the presence of the Mater Dolorosa and all of these things have only been tolerated as heresies in the Western tradition. And it is the Western tradition that has the most continuous break with this symbiotic relationship. In other words, we have wandered into a state of prolonged neurosis because of the absence of a direct pipeline to the unconscious. And we have then fallen victim to priestcraft of every conceivable sort. A similar situation, which may give us some objective perspective on our own, haunts the fate of those portions of Indo-European humanity that went east instead of west. In other words, the whole story of Indian civilization is the story of a masculine, static, hierarchically organized system coming into place in the wake of the loss of the secret of Soma, the loss of the portal to another kind of vegetable gnosis. Well, so provided then that I have made my case and convinced you that this is all gospel, what kind of options are there to someone who believes this? Well, What that means is a brief survey of the anthropological opportunities to explore hallucinogenesis presently afforded by societies living throughout the world. There are, of course, the psilocybin complex discovered by Gordon Wasson, the magic mushrooms of central Mexico, which may have played a role in the Mayan and Toltec civilizations, and the wider-ranging pantropical Stropharia cubensis, Psilocybe cubensis, which originated in Thailand but is distributed throughout the warm tropics. Interesting, all of these shamanically sanctioned hallucinogens are in the indole family, a very narrow family of compounds, with the exception, I almost blew it, with the exception of mescaline, which is in a different family, a kind of amphetamine. But all the others, including the Morning Glory complex with its LSD-like alkaloids, chenoclavine and ergonomine, the psilocybin complex, which involves, as I said, several pandemic species and many highly indemnized species, especially in the Pacific Northwest, the Iboka cult of Gabon and Western Africa, which is sort of the exotic cousin of all of these things, but nevertheless structurally an indole, and then the short-acting tryptamines and the beta-carbolines. The short-acting tryptamines can be used separately. The beta-carbolines, though hallucinogenic in themselves, are usually used as monoamine oxidase inhibitors to enhance the effect of short-acting tryptamines. This is a highly evolved pharmacology and shamanic complex in South America. One of the peculiar puzzles of shamanic anthropology and ethnobotany is the clustering of hallucinogenic plants in South America. Why are the Old World tropics, the tropics of the Moluccas and Indonesia, not equally rich in hallucinogenic flora? No one can answer this question, but certainly Mesoamerica and the New World seems to be the great home of these things. You notice that I don't mention any synthetics in the list. This is because I would sort of like to peel away the vision-producing plants from the whole Stromundang of the drug problem and the drug issue, which is a whole other kettle of fish and has to do with the fates of nations and trillion-dollar scamola and who knows what else. I prefer the organic hallucinogens and recommend them to other people because I think their long history of shamanic usage is the first seal of approval that you must look for. I mean, if these things have been used for thousands of years, then you can be fairly confident that they do not cause tumors or miscarriages, or that this has, because nature is far richer in exotic and poisonous and mutagenic and psychoactive chemicals than the human pharmacopoeia. I mean, many things are avoided. There are many potential hallucinogens that are not utilized by human beings. So there has been a certain trial and error selectivity applied to these things. I think it's important to confine oneself to compounds which are least insulting to the physical brain, not because the physical brain has anything to do with the mind particularly, but because it certainly has to do with the metabolic end state of indoles. And so things which are alien to the brain should probably not be introduced into it. One way of judging how long a relationship between a human population and a plant has been in place is to see how benign the compound is in human metabolism. I mean, if you take some plant and your knees are feeling rubbery 3 days later, or your eyes aren't in focus 48 hours later, then this is not a benign compound. This is not a compound where there has been a smooth hand-in-glove fit with the human user. This is why, to my mind, the tryptamines are so interesting, and why, another reason why, one I just thought of, that I argue for the mushroom as the primary hallucinogen involved in human origins, because these things bear a weird resemblance to human neurochemistry. The human brain, and indeed all nervous systems, run on 5-hydroxytryptamine, serotonin. NN-dimethyltryptamine is the hallucinogenic compound of this Amazonian complex, is the most powerful of all hallucinogens in the human system, and yet clears your system in a matter of minutes. This argues for a great antiquity of the relationship between these things. Well, so then, having discussed options, it would remain, it seems, to discuss techniques, since it's almost what Huxley called a gratuitous grace. All conditions for success can be present, and one can still fail. Although not if all conditions for success are present and one does it over and over again. Maybe there's a temporal variable there. I'm not sure. But technique to me is a kind of I'm reluctant to talk about it because it seems so obvious to me what good technique is. I mean, you sit down, you shut up, and you pay attention is basically the good technique. And then the footnotes add, on an empty stomach, in a dark room, feeling comfortable. And then sit down, shut up, pay attention. It's something which happens behind the eyelids. It is not eidetic hallucination, although it begins like eidetic hallucination. I've been talking about this kind of stuff now for about 10 years, publicly like this, and one of the major things, the major conceptual and linguistic problem to get over is to actually convey to people what's being talked about. Because probably, I would assume, 95% of the people in this room have something under their belt which they call drug experience. But did you know that yours is different from everybody else's? And that these things range from, mild tingling in the feet to, language fails. And the thing to put across is the reality of the presence of this thing. And this is the importance in talking to a group with an interest in transpersonal psychology. The situation that we now reside in is not one of seeking the answer, but facing the answer. The answer has been found. It just happens to lie on the wrong side of the fence of social toleration and legality. And so we're just forced into this strange little war dance where everybody knows that psychedelics are the most powerful instrument for the study of the mind conceivable. And yet, a lot of people are still ratomorphically involved in the academic and university system, trying to ignore the fact that the tool has been placed in our hands, like the 16th century when the telescope was invented, we have proven that we are not large enough to take the tool into our own hands without a social and intellectual transformation. And I think it must begin in the field of psychology by acknowledging that if what we are involved in, if what this paradigm transform is the archaic revival, and that we really can create a caring, refeminized, eco-sensitive, global world by going back to these very, very old models, then it isn't going to be possible to do it on the strength of political exhortation and rap alone. It's going to have to rest on an experience that just shakes you to your roots, that is real and that is generalized and that can then be talked about and dissected. We need to acknowledge the depth of our dilemma and the real truth, I think, that we know about our options out. I mean, we're playing with half a deck as long as we tolerate that the cardinals of government and science should dictate where human curiosity can legitimately send its attention and where it cannot. I mean, it's a essentially preposterous situation. It is essentially a civil rights issue, because what we're talking about here is the repression of a religious sensibility. In fact, not a religious sensibility, the religious sensibility, not built on some con game spun out by eunuchs, but based on the symbiotic relationship that was in place for our species for 50,000 years before the advent of history, writing, priestcraft, and propaganda. So it's a clarion call to recover a birthright, however uncomfortable that may make us. A call to realize that life lived in the absence of the psychedelic experience that primordial shamanism is based on is life trivialized, life denied, life enslaved to the ego and its fear of dissolution in this mysterious mama matrix which is all around us and which apparently extends to infinity, and where our historical future actually lies. This is the other thing. It is now very clear that techniques of mind-human interfacing, pharmacology of the synthetic variety, all kinds of manipulative techniques, all kinds of data storage, imaging, and retrieval techniques, all of this is coalescing toward the potential of a truly demonic or angelic kind of self-imaging of our culture. And the people who are on the demonic side are fully aware of this and hurrying full tilt forward with their plans to capture everyone as a 100% believing consumer inside some kind of beige-furnished fascism that won't even raise a ripple. So,